Jason Jacks Thompson, only 19, ran the streets of Liverpool like a king. Beside him, 22-year-old Mia Shade Collins enforced his rules with a ferocity that left the neighborhood terrified. Together, they ruled entire postcodes, where the law feared to tread and every corner hid danger. But in a city built on fear and loyalty, one mistake could cost them everything, and in Liverpool's no-go zones, no one was untouchable. Liverpool had always been a city built on pride, history, and hard work, but there were corners of it that told a different story. Tucked away behind rows of terraced houses and crumbling high-rises were areas the newspapers called no-go zones. These were places where crime was not a whisper but an everyday presence, where the sight of hooded figures on street corners was as normal as children walking to school. For outsiders, they were places to avoid. For those born there, they were impossible to escape. The transformation of these postcodes did not happen overnight. Once they had been ordinary neighborhoods where dockworkers lived with their families, where doors were left unlocked and neighbors shared tea and conversation. But as industries collapsed and jobs vanished, the streets changed. What was left behind was poverty, anger, and a vacuum waiting to be filled. That vacuum was quickly taken over by those willing to bend or break the rules. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, gangs began to mark their presence with graffiti tags and burnt-out cars. A few families quietly tried to hold on to the old way of life, but the sound of gunshots or the smell of petrol after an arson attack became all too common. Residents who once knew every neighbor by name now closed their curtains early and kept their heads down. Trust in the police weakened with each incident. Reports were filed, arrests were made, but the same faces always returned to the streets. The message was clear. Authority ended at the edge of certain postcodes. Inside these streets, rules existed, but they weren't written in law. They were enforced through intimidation, violence, and the unspoken understanding that silence was survival. Young boys were drawn into this world long before they understood the consequences. At first, they were told to carry messages or hide packages. Then came the harder tasks, watching for police cars, intimidating strangers, collecting debts. Refusal was rarely an option. For many of them, it wasn't just about money, but identity. To be respected in the postcode was worth more than anything else. For outsiders, stepping into these areas was like crossing an invisible border. Taxi drivers avoided certain streets after dark. Emergency services often waited for backup before entering. Journalists, when they did venture inside, described the tension in the air, the way groups of young men watched their every move, daring them to make a mistake. These weren't just troubled neighborhoods, they had become territories where the gangs set the rules and the community lived in fear of breaking them. The tragedy was that beneath the fear and violence, ordinary families still lived there. Mothers raised children in the same houses where their own parents had once built lives. Some tried desperately to keep their children away from the gangs, but with no jobs, poor schools, and few opportunities, the pull of the streets was relentless. In these postcodes, the promise of quick money and instant respect was more tempting than the slow struggle of trying to escape. What made the no-go zones most dangerous was not just the crime, but the silence. People saw everything yet said nothing. Neighbors who had witnessed shootings or arson attacks turned their heads, knowing that one word to the police could mean retaliation. The gangs didn't need to threaten every household. Their reputation alone was enough to keep entire communities quiet. Fear was their greatest weapon, and it worked better than any gun or knife. By the time the rest of the city noticed what was happening, the damage was already done. These postcodes were no longer just struggling communities. They were strongholds. Strongholds where survival depended on who you knew, what rules you followed, and how willing you were to play by the gang's code. It started small, with young men selling cannabis at bus stops and outside pubs, slipping 10-pound deals into eager hands. What seemed like petty crime at first quickly evolved as stronger drugs poured into Liverpool. Heroin and crack cocaine became the backbone of an underground empire, and those who controlled the supply soon controlled the streets. The young dealers turned into feared gang members, and the small corners where they once traded became battlegrounds for power. At the center of this rise were groups of street leaders who understood that fear alone wasn't enough. They needed structure. Crews began forming around tight-knit groups of friends, usually men who had grown up together on the same estate. Loyalty was demanded, and betrayal was punished brutally. The gangs were organized like businesses, with ranks, roles, and responsibilities. At the bottom were the runners, children barely in their teens, tasked with carrying packages and keeping watch for police. Above them were the enforcers, hardened young men with reputations for violence. At the top sat the gang leaders, who rarely touched the drugs themselves but made every important decision. The drug market transformed the economy of these postcodes. While legitimate businesses closed their doors, the gangs thrived. They provided jobs, dangerous ones, but jobs nonetheless. For a teenager with no qualifications and little hope of employment, the lure of quick money was impossible to resist. Some made more in a week than their parents did in a month. Designer clothes, expensive trainers, and flashy cars became the symbols of success, worn proudly as proof of power. In these communities, respect was measured by fear, and nothing gained more fear than wealth built on crime. But the rise of the street kings also brought bloodshed. Rival gangs claimed different estates, and boundaries were drawn in invisible lines across the city. Crossing into the wrong postcode was seen as an insult, and every insult had to be answered. At first, it was bricks through windows, then knives pulled in alleyways. Soon, it escalated to shootings, the sound of gunfire echoing through narrow streets at night. Each attack sparked retaliation, and each retaliation deepened the cycle of violence. Families who had lived peacefully side by side for decades now found themselves divided by postcode loyalty, forced to pick sides or risk being caught in the middle. The authorities tried to respond, but the gangs had grown clever. They used younger children who couldn't be charged as adults, kept phones unregistered, and changed cars regularly. They spread fear so deeply that even when people knew who had committed a crime, no one dared to speak. A wall of silence protected the street kings, making them feel untouchable. Their names became legends, spoken in whispers. Some were admired for their wealth and daring, others were despised for their cruelty. But all of them commanded respect in a way no outsider ever could. Liverpool's no-go zones had produced a new generation of rulers. They were not elected, not chosen by the people, but forced upon the community through violence and intimidation. Their grip on the postcodes was so strong that even the police acknowledged it in private. The gangs didn't just deal drugs, they controlled the rhythm of life. They decided who could walk where, who could sell what, and who would pay the price for stepping out of line. Their rise had turned forgotten neighborhoods into kingdoms, and their reign was only just beginning. The gangs learned early that control wasn't just about who sold the most drugs, it was about who could keep a community silent. Fear became their most valuable currency. By the mid-2000s, entire neighborhoods lived under a system of intimidation so effective that even those who despised the gangs felt forced to comply. Shopkeepers were among the first targets. Independent corner stores, off-licenses, and takeaway owners were approached with demands for tax. The sums varied, sometimes small enough to seem harmless, other times large enough to cripple a business, but the message was always the same: pay us or suffer the consequences. Those who paid were left alone, at least for a while. Those who resisted quickly learned what defiance cost. Windows were smashed repeatedly, until owners gave in. Cars parked outside were set on fire in the dead of night, the flames lighting up the estate as a reminder to everyone watching. A few shopkeepers who went to the police soon found themselves facing worse punishment. Within days they were harassed, their families threatened, and their businesses vandalized beyond repair. The gangs rarely had to repeat themselves. Once an example was made, others fell into line. The system spread beyond businesses. Landlords renting properties in gang-controlled streets were forced to pay for protection. Refusal often led to tenants being intimidated. Drug users deliberately moved into their buildings or properties left wrecked by arson. Even delivery drivers and tradesmen were not spared. Entering these postcodes meant dealing with gatekeepers who demanded a cut of whatever money was being earned. To survive, most outsiders either avoided the area completely or accepted the tax as a cost of doing business. Perhaps the most disturbing part of this empire of fear was the way children were used. Teenagers who still should have been in school were turned into enforcers. They carried out low-level intimidation, blocking shop entrances, following strangers, scrawling threats on doors. To the gangs, using kids had two advantages: they were less likely to attract police attention, and their involvement bound them deeper into the criminal world. By the time these children reached adulthood, they had already crossed so many lines there was no way back. Ordinary residents bore the brunt of this climate. Families kept their curtains drawn and their conversations quiet. They learned not to ask questions about who had been attacked or why a certain car had been burned out. The fewer details you knew, the safer you were. Parents begged their children to stay out of trouble, but with playgrounds empty and youth clubs closed, the streets became the only place to belong. Many young people saw no choice but to accept the gang's presence. What made the business of fear most effective was the silence it created. Police investigations stumbled because no one would talk. Even when violence happened in broad daylight, witnesses melted away, their memories suddenly blank. On rare occasions when someone did speak up, rumors spread quickly, and before long the individual would be driven out or worse, violently punished. It was this silence that cemented the gang's authority, giving them the power of rulers without ever needing official titles. The gangs didn't just sell drugs, they owned the atmosphere of the streets. Fear hung in the air like smoke after a fire, choking the life out of any attempt to resist. The business of fear was more than a tactic. It was the foundation of the no-go zones, and it made the gangs stronger than any law could. The fragile peace between rival postcodes could never last. For years, invisible borders had been drawn across Liverpool, each estate claimed by a different gang. At first, tensions were managed with warnings, threats, and the occasional beating, but the balance was too delicate to hold forever. The first spark came from something seemingly minor: a teenage runner straying into territory he didn't belong in. He was carrying a small amount of drugs, barely enough to make a profit, but his presence in enemy streets was seen as an insult. He was cornered by a group of older boys and left bleeding in an alley, a warning that no one crossed lines without permission. News of the assault spread fast, and revenge followed just as quickly. Weeks later, shots rang out on a quiet evening when a masked gunman fired at a group standing outside a corner shop. One young man collapsed, fatally wounded, while the others scattered in panic. The attack wasn't random, it was a message. A single act of violence had now escalated into something much bigger. Fear, once confined to whispers about gangs and protection money, now carried the echo of gunfire. The community understood what was happening. The postcode wars had begun. Retaliations came thick and fast. Cars were torched outside family homes, and houses were sprayed with bullets. Young men armed with knives patrolled their blocks like soldiers defending a border. The violence became a cycle, each attack sparking a response more brutal than the last. For many of the gang members, this wasn't just about drugs or money anymore. It was about respect, pride, and reputation. Losing face was worse than losing money, and every wound, every insult, demanded payback. The police presence increased, but it did little to stop the bloodshed. Officers patrolled in marked cars. But the gangs always seemed to know when they were coming. By the time blue lights appeared, attackers had vanished into alleyways or disappeared into houses where no one would speak against them. The community remained silent, caught between fear of the gangs and distrust of the authorities. Even those who wanted to help saw what happened to anyone who cooperated, and the risk was too great. Families who had no involvement in the gangs began to suffer too. Innocent teenagers walking home from school were mistaken for rivals and attacked. Parents sent their children out of the area to stay with relatives, desperate to keep them safe. Streets that had once been full of kids playing football now emptied at nightfall, as residents locked their doors and prayed the violence wouldn't reach their homes. The first murder had been a turning point, but it was far from the last. Over the following months, more lives were claimed, each one adding to the weight of grief that hung over the estates. Memorials of flowers and candles appeared on street corners, but even in mourning, the tension never eased. Everyone knew that another attack was only a matter of time. What began with a teenage runner had spiraled into a war with no clear end. Each postcode was determined not to back down, even if it meant destroying their own communities in the process. The cycle of violence had been set in motion, and with every act of revenge, Liverpool's no-go zones sank deeper into chaos. Behind the chaos and bloodshed, there was money, more than most people could imagine. The gangs that controlled Liverpool's no-go zones weren't simply street-level thugs. They were running an underground economy that rivaled small businesses. Every corner, every flat, and every alleyway had a price attached to it, and those who controlled the supply chains held the keys to unimaginable wealth. Drugs were the most visible source, but they were far from the only one. Weapons, stolen goods, and illegal gambling networks created a constant flow of cash that kept the gangs powerful and untouchable. The wealth was hidden in plain sight. Leaders who appeared to be ordinary men walking the streets in tracksuits actually owned multiple properties across the city. Cars were not just for transportation. They were symbols of success, often bought in cash, untraceable, and sometimes left with false plates to avoid detection. These possessions made the gang leaders visible, yet invisible. Visible in the lifestyle they flaunted, invisible to law enforcement due to careful planning and the use of intermediaries. The flashy lifestyle sent a clear message: power came with rewards, and the street kings were untouchable. Connections outside the city reinforced this power. Smugglers in Spain, couriers in South America, and corrupt middlemen across Europe all played roles in supplying the drugs that filled Liverpool's streets. A shipment could vanish for days, only to reappear in discreet locations, and no one outside the gang knew how it had arrived. The networks were carefully managed, and the more distant the supplier, the more untouchable the operation became. Local leaders didn't just sell drugs, they orchestrated an entire system of logistics and influence that turned postcodes into small kingdoms. The gangs also invested in ways that would protect their money and extend their reach. Some purchased properties in quiet areas far from the estates they controlled, using them as storage or safe houses. Others laundered money through seemingly legitimate businesses, garages, corner shops, and even small construction companies. Every pound earned in the streets could be transformed into legitimate wealth, creating a shield against the law. The more entrenched they became, the harder it was for authorities to disrupt their operation. Yet the lure of wealth brought its own dangers. Power struggles emerged within the ranks. As ambitious members began to challenge their leaders, loyalty was constantly tested, and betrayal was punished with ruthless efficiency. Friends became enemies overnight when greed outweighed respect. Even as the wealth grew, so did paranoia. Leaders lived in fear of their own crews as much as rival gangs. Trust became a rare commodity, and every transaction, every meeting, was shadowed by suspicion. For residents of the no-go zones, the presence of money was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it brought a sense of power and pride to the streets, creating an illusion of control over their environment. On the other, it made life more dangerous, as every wealthy gang leader was a target for rivals and law enforcement alike. Children who grew up witnessing the lifestyle were drawn to it, dreaming of fast money and fast respect, often unaware of the deadly consequences. Liverpool's gangs had built an empire from fear, violence, and cunning. The wealth they accumulated didn't just fund their lifestyle, it cemented their influence over the streets, making them untouchable and ensuring that in the no-go zones, power and money were inseparable. The cycle of violence, loyalty, and greed had become the backbone of life in these postcodes, and the streets themselves were the ultimate proof of their control. Power in Liverpool's no-go zones was never permanent. The same ambition and greed that built empires also destroyed them. The kingpins who had ruled for years lived in constant fear of betrayal, knowing that loyalty could shift in an instant. One notorious leader, a man feared across several postcodes for his cunning and ruthlessness, became a target not for outside gangs but for his own crew. He had grown too arrogant, making deals without consulting trusted lieutenants and flaunting wealth that others believed should have been shared. His rise had been spectacular, but it would also be his undoing. The first signs of trouble were subtle. Trusted allies began disappearing from meetings, excuses were made, and messages were ignored. Rumors circulated that some within his crew were secretly negotiating with rival gangs, planning to take over his territory. No one outside the inner circle knew the truth, but inside, the tension was palpable. The kingpin's enemies didn't act recklessly. They knew that a failed attempt could provoke retaliation. Instead, they watched, waited, and prepared meticulously. Every detail was calculated. Then came the ambush. One night, outside a nightclub he frequented, the kingpin stepped into what seemed like a routine meeting. Within moments, masked men appeared from the shadows, guns drawn. He had no warning, no chance to escape. Bullets tore through the night, and when the shooting stopped, the man who had controlled entire postcodes lay dead on the pavement. The message was clear: even the most feared figures were not untouchable, and betrayal was punished without hesitation. The aftermath of his death sent shockwaves across Liverpool. His followers were thrown into chaos, unsure who to trust or how to react. Rival gangs seized the opportunity to claim his territory, leading to a surge in violence as power struggles erupted. The very streets he had ruled with an iron fist became battlegrounds, each attack a bid for dominance. Families who had lived under his protection now faced uncertainty and fear. No one was safe from the consequences of the shifting power. Meanwhile, the police were both frustrated and intrigued. A figure so prominent falling in such a violent way drew media attention, but the inner workings of the gang remained hidden. Witnesses were terrified to come forward, and the codes of silence held firm. For law enforcement, this was a rare glimpse into the volatility of the gang hierarchy, but even they understood that removing a kingpin did not solve the problem. It merely created a vacuum waiting to be filled. The killing also had psychological effects on the gangs themselves. Younger members, previously loyal, began to question their leaders. Ambition surged, and with ambition came ruthlessness. Trust was no longer a given, and paranoia spread through every postcodes network. Leaders began arming themselves more heavily, conducting meetings in secret locations, and monitoring every movement. The streets had grown more dangerous than ever. In the end, the death of the kingpin was both an end and a beginning. It marked the collapse of a reign built on fear and cunning, but also set the stage for a new generation of violent leaders, even younger and more merciless. In Liverpool's no-go zones, power was temporary, and survival depended on being smarter, faster, and deadlier than anyone else. The cycle of ambition, betrayal, and bloodshed continued, proving that in these streets, no one truly ruled forever. By the time law enforcement finally mounted a serious response, the gangs of Liverpool's no-go zones had already entrenched themselves for years. The police were no longer chasing petty dealers. They were facing highly organized networks with reach across multiple postcodes. Coordinated raids became necessary, with hundreds of officers involved, vehicles blocking streets, and helicopters monitoring the estates from above. The operation was one of the largest in Merseyside's history, designed to dismantle not just individuals but the entire infrastructure of crime that had made these areas untouchable. The raids were dramatic. Flats were stormed in the early hours, doors were broken down, and drugs, cash, and weapons were seized. Gang leaders were arrested, some caught by surprise, others already suspecting betrayal within their ranks. The operation sent shockwaves through the communities, creating a brief sense of relief. Streets that had once been tense and hostile grew quiet, as residents cautiously stepped outside, daring to imagine life without constant fear. For a moment, the no-go zones seemed vulnerable, their power shaken. But even as the authorities celebrated small victories, the gangs were adapting. The arrests, while significant, targeted individuals, but did not dismantle the networks themselves. Others stepped into the vacuums left behind, younger and more ruthless than their predecessors. Encrypted phones, hidden stash houses, and carefully coded messages allowed the gangs to continue operating while staying just out of reach. The police had won battles, but the war was far from over. The same streets that had once echoed with gunfire and sirens now carried whispers of new leaders consolidating their power. Residents noticed changes as well. Some fled, afraid of retaliation for cooperating or being associated with anyone arrested. Others tried to reclaim their streets, but the shadow of gang influence remained. Schools and youth clubs attempted programs to draw young people away from crime, yet the pull of money and respect in the streets was strong. For many teenagers, the allure of the gangs was impossible to resist. Even when the risk was clear, law enforcement could intervene, but the social problems fueling gang involvement persisted. The operation also revealed the depth of secrecy within the gangs. Investigators found that leaders had planned for such raids, moving weapons and drugs in advance and using trusted intermediaries to maintain supply chains. It became clear that disrupting the gang economy required more than arrests. It demanded understanding the social dynamics, financial networks, and fear-based control that allowed these organizations to thrive. Without this knowledge, the gangs could recover as quickly as they were struck. Despite the crackdowns, the community's trust in law enforcement remained fragile. People remained reluctant to testify or provide information, fearing the consequences of speaking out. In some ways, the raids only reinforced the perception that the police were outsiders, capable of temporary disruption, but incapable of long-term change. For the gangs, the crackdowns became a challenge to overcome rather than a threat to fear. In the weeks following the raids, the streets returned to a tense normalcy. The temporary lull in violence allowed some residents to breathe, but everyone knew that the gangs were regrouping. New leaders emerged, rivalries flared, and the underground economy adapted to new threats. The police had made their mark, but in Liverpool's no-go zones, crime was resilient. The streets belonged to those who controlled fear, wealth, and loyalty, and no single operation could break a system built over decades. Even after the largest police operations and the fall of notorious leaders, the no-go zones of Liverpool remained a world apart, bound by fear, poverty, and the unbroken cycle of crime. For the residents, life continued under rules they did not write, enforced by gangs who still held power over their streets. The temporary silences brought by arrests and raids offered only brief respite. The deeper problems, broken homes, poor schools, and limited opportunities, continued to push young people toward the same dangerous paths. In many ways, nothing had changed. Children growing up in these postcodes learned early that survival depended on knowing the boundaries and the people who enforced them. Respect, loyalty, and fear were lessons taught at playgrounds and street corners long before they entered classrooms. Some managed to avoid the pull of the gangs, driven by ambition, family support, or sheer luck, but the majority were exposed to the allure of quick money and instant respect. Every designer trainer or flashy car was a reminder of what could be gained by bending or breaking the rules. To escape was possible, but it required courage and vision few possessed. The legacy of violence remained visible everywhere. Graffiti marked territories, burnt-out cars, and abandoned buildings served as grim reminders of past conflicts, and memorials for the dead dotted the streets. Families still mourned loved ones lost to shootings, stabbings, and drug-related incidents. The psychological scars ran deep. Residents were hyper-aware of threats, wary of strangers, and cautious in daily life. Even small disagreements could escalate if interpreted as disrespect, and revenge often followed swiftly, feeding the ongoing cycle. Yet, within the darkness, life continued. Markets, shops, and homes functioned under the unspoken laws of the gangs, creating a parallel society where survival and adaptation replaced freedom. Some families tried to shield their children, moving them to safer schools or encouraging hobbies away from the streets, But the pull of the postcode was strong. Peer pressure, poverty, and the desire to belong kept many trapped. Even those who left physically often carried the influence of their upbringing, returning to protect siblings or friends, or drawn back by nostalgia and necessity. The gangs themselves evolved. New leaders, younger and more ruthless than their predecessors, adapted to changing circumstances. Technology offered tools for secrecy, making their operations harder to detect. Loyalty remained a prized commodity, but suspicion and paranoia were constant companions. Each generation learned from the mistakes of the last. Arrests, betrayals, and killings were studied, and strategies adjusted. The streets were no longer just a place of survival, they were a training ground for a new wave of criminals, ready to continue the legacy. For outsiders, the no-go zones were still dangerous, places to be avoided, but for the community, they were home. Life inside these postcodes was a constant balancing act between fear and resilience, danger and necessity. People adapted, found ways to navigate the streets, and even formed bonds within the harsh reality imposed by the gangs. The city outside might see these areas as lawless, but inside there were rules, unwritten, brutal, and absolute. Liverpool's no-go zones remained a stark reminder that crime, poverty, and fear could persist despite intervention. The cycle was unbroken, each generation inheriting the struggles of the last. In these streets, power shifted, leaders fell, and lives were lost. But life went on, shaped by the invisible forces of control, survival, and the relentless grip of the gangs. The story of these postcodes was far from over, a living testament to a world where freedom was rare and survival demanded everything.